The warning lights turned red, and the alarm screamed through the small cockpit of the scout vessel Meadowlark. Lieutenant Danny Cole pulled hard on the controls, but nothing responded. His ship was falling through the atmosphere of an uncharted planet, and he could do nothing to stop it. 30 seconds ago, everything had been normal. Danny had been running a routine survey of the outer systems, cataloging planets that might be suitable for future exploration. Then something had hit his ship. Not a weapon exactly, but some kind of energy pulse that came from the planet below. It had passed through his hull like it was not even there and killed every system on board. Now he was a passenger, in a metal coffin falling toward a world he knew nothing about. Danny grabbed the emergency handles and braced himself. The ship hit the upper atmosphere and began to shake violently. Through the small viewport, he could see fire dancing across the hull as friction heated the metal to dangerous temperatures. He closed his eyes and thought about his family back on Earth. His mother would receive a message saying he was missing in action. His younger brother would probably volunteer for dangerous missions trying to find him. Danny hoped neither of them would do anything foolish. The ship broke through the clouds and Danny opened his eyes. Below him was a landscape of green and gold. Massive structures rose from the surface like mountains, but they were too regular to be natural. They were buildings. Someone had built things of incredible size on this world. He had no time to wonder about it. The ground rushed up to meet him and Danny braced for impact. The crash was violent but survivable. The Meadowlark was designed to protect its pilot in exactly this kind of situation. Foam restraints deployed around Danny and held him in place while the ship tore through what seemed like a forest of enormous plants. Metal screamed and glass shattered. Then everything went still. Danny waited for a moment before releasing the restraints. His body hurt everywhere, but nothing seemed broken. He checked his systems and found that most of them were completely dead. The communication array was destroyed. The engines were offline and likely damaged beyond repair. Life support was functioning on backup power but would only last for a few days. He needed to get out and assess the situation. Danny opened the emergency hatch and climbed out of his ruined ship. What he saw made him freeze in place. He was standing in what appeared to be a garden, but the plants around him were not normal. The flowers were the size of houses. The grass reached up to his chest. A single leaf from a nearby bush was large enough to use as a blanket. Everything was enormous. No, Danny realized, everything was normal-sized. He was the one who was small. This planet was home to giants. Before he could process this information, he heard a sound that shook the ground beneath his feet. Footsteps, heavy footsteps coming closer. Danny looked up and saw something that made his heart nearly stop. A figure was walking toward him through the garden. She was humanoid in shape with 2 arms and 2 legs and a face that was almost human, but she was massive. Danny estimated her height at roughly 40 feet. She was young by the standards of her species, with long dark hair and skin that had a slight blue tint. Her eyes were purple and currently fixed on the smoking wreckage of his ship. She had not seen him yet. Danny considered running, but there was nowhere to go. He considered hiding, but she would find his ship and know that someone had been inside it. He considered fighting, but the idea was laughable. He had a standard sidearm that would probably feel like an insect bite to a creature of her size. So he stood his ground and waited. The giantess reached the wreckage and knelt down to examine it. Her face showed confusion and curiosity. She poked at the metal with one enormous finger and made a sound of surprise when she touched something hot. Then she noticed Danny. For a long moment they simply stared at each other. Danny at this impossible being who towered over him like a living skyscraper. The giantess at this tiny creature standing beside a machine that had fallen from the sky. She reached toward him slowly. Danny held up his hands and shouted for her to stop. She paused at the sound of his voice. Her purple eyes went wide with shock. She said something in a language he did not understand, but her tone was one of amazement. She reached for him again, and this time Danny did not resist. Her fingers closed around him gently, more carefully than he would have expected. She lifted him up to her face and studied him with intense curiosity. Danny could feel her breath washing over him like a warm wind. He needed to show her that he was intelligent, that he was not an animal or a pest, but a thinking being who deserved respect. Danny pointed at himself and said his name clearly. Then he pointed at his ship and made a flying gesture with his hand. He pointed at the sky and then back at himself. The message was simple: I came from up there. The giantess understood. He could see it in her eyes. The confusion gave way to wonder and then to something like excitement. She spoke again, and this time she pointed at herself. The word sounded like. Danny repeated it and she smiled. It was strange to see such a human expression on a face so large, but it gave him hope. Carried him back toward the massive buildings he had seen during his fall. Each step she took covered more ground than Danny could have walked in a minute. The world around him was overwhelming in its scale. Birds flew past that were larger than eagles. Insects buzzed by that could have carried him away. Everything on this planet existed at a size that made humans seem like toys. They reached a structure that Danny realized was a home, entered through a door that was 50 feet tall and carried him inside. The interior was decorated with furniture and art that would have been normal in any human dwelling if not for the impossible scale. She set him down on a table and then sat in a chair across from him. For the next hour they attempted to communicate. Danny drew pictures in a layer of dust on the table's surface, a circle for his planet, a line for his journey, his ship, the crash, watched with growing understanding. When he finished, she drew something in return, a symbol that looked official, figures in uniforms, a building with bars on the windows. She pointed at Danny and then at the symbol and shook her head firmly. Her meaning was clear. If the authorities found him, he would be locked away. She pointed at herself and then at Danny. She made a covering gesture with her hands. She would hide him. Danny did not know if he could trust her. He did not know anything about this world or its people or their intentions, but he had no other choice. His ship was broken. He was alone on a planet of giants, and this young giantess named was offering to protect him. He nodded his agreement and smiled again. It was the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted, a friendship between beings separated by size but connected by something more important. Danny Cole had crashed among giantesses. Now he needed to find a way home, and he was starting to realize that escape would mean risking everything. 3 weeks passed, and Danny learned more about the world of Prime than any human had ever known. He learned that the giants called themselves the. He learned that their civilization was ancient and powerful. He learned that they believed themselves to be alone in the universe, the only intelligent life that had ever existed. His presence challenged everything they thought they knew. Taught him words in her language, and he taught her words in his. Communication became easier with each passing day. She explained that they had never developed space travel. They had looked at the stars and wondered what was out there, but they had never found a way to reach them. The technology required was beyond their understanding. This confused Danny at first. They had built magnificent cities. They had medicine and art and complex social structures. But when he examined their technology more closely, he began to understand. Their machines were powered by steam and electricity. They had no computers as humans understood them. Their progress had followed a different path than humanity. They had grown large and powerful, but they had never learned to fly among the stars. Danny spent his days hidden in a small room that had prepared for him. It was actually a decorative box that she kept on a shelf, large enough for him to live in comfortably. She had furnished it with scraps of soft fabric and small containers of water. She brought him food that she had carefully prepared in tiny portions. A single crumb of her bread was a full meal for him. At night, when the city was quiet, would take him out and they would talk. Danny told her about Earth and humanity. He described the oceans and mountains and forests. He explained that there were billions of humans on his world, each one about his size, listened with fascination and asked endless questions. She told him about society in return. The world was ruled by a council of elder females. Males existed but held lower positions in society. Everything was structured around tradition and law. The valued order above all else. They feared anything that might disturb the balance of their civilization. This was why Danny had to remain hidden. If the authorities discovered him, they would see him as a threat, not because he was dangerous but because of what he represented. Proof that they were not alone. Proof that the universe was larger and stranger than they had imagined. Some would welcome this knowledge, but many would fear it. During the second week, introduced Danny to her sister. Myra was older than by several years. She was taller and more serious with the same dark hair but sharper features. When she first saw Danny, she screamed and nearly knocked over a shelf trying to get away from him. It took an hour to calm her down enough to listen. Danny stood on the table and waited patiently while the sisters argued in their language. He caught some words he recognized: dangerous, forbidden, prison. kept pointing at Danny and making gestures that seemed to mean harmless and friend and please trust me. Finally, Myra approached the table and looked down at him. Her purple eyes were filled with suspicion and fear. Danny did not blame her. If a tiny alien had appeared in his home, he would have been terrified too. He spoke slowly, using the words he had learned. "I am Danny. I come from far away. I mean no harm. I only want to go home." Myra stared at him for a long moment. Then she asked a question that translated, "Why should we help you?" Danny thought carefully before answering. He could have talked about duty or morality or the bonds between intelligent species, but he suspected that Myra would not care about such abstract concepts. "Because already decided to help me," he said, "and if someone discovers me now, you will both be in trouble. The only way to protect yourselves is to help me leave." It was not the noble answer he might have given, but it was honest and practical, and it worked. Myra nodded slowly and agreed to keep the secret. From that point forward, both sisters helped Danny with his repairs. The work was incredibly difficult. Danny needed to fix his ship, but every component on the Meadowlark was designed for human hands. The sisters could provide materials, but they could not perform delicate repairs. A wire that was thin to them was a heavy cable to Danny. A drop of their industrial sealant was enough to flood his entire engine compartment. Danny worked for hours each night, climbing through the guts of his broken ship, testing systems, replacing damaged parts with improvised substitutes. Progress was painfully slow, but he made progress. The communication array was beyond saving. He would not be able to call for help. The hull had multiple breaches that he could only seal temporarily. Life support would function, but barely. The navigation computer was damaged and would need to be repaired. The main problem was the engines. The energy pulse that had brought down his ship had burned out his primary fuel cells. Without power, he could not fly. Without flight, he could not escape. He explained this problem too, and she thought for several days before offering a solution. There was a place in the capital called the Forbidden Archives. It was where the stored things they did not understand, objects that had fallen from the sky over the centuries, artifacts that explanation. The ruling council had declared these things dangerous and locked them away where no one could study them. Believed there might be technology there that could help Danny. Other crashed ships perhaps, fuel cells or power sources that matched his systems. But the Forbidden Archives were exactly what the name suggested. Forbidden. Anyone caught entering without permission would be imprisoned. Anyone caught removing artifacts would face even worse punishment. Danny thanked her for the information, but said he would find another way. He did not want the sisters to take any more risks. They had already done enough. Then something happened that changed everything. A neighbor noticed that was behaving strangely. She was buying unusual supplies. She was keeping odd hours. She was refusing visitors. The neighbor reported her suspicions to the local wardens. Danny was eating dinner in his small room when rushed in with panic on her face. She explained what had happened in rapid sentences. Wardens were coming. They would search the house. They would find him. There was no time to move the ship. There was barely time to hide Danny himself. Myra arrived minutes later, and the three of them worked frantically. They concealed Danny inside a decorative container that would not attract attention. They covered the ship with gardening supplies and debris. They practiced innocent explanations for every unusual item in the house. When the wardens arrived, the sisters greeted them calmly and invited them inside. Danny listened from his hiding place as enormous footsteps moved through the house. He heard voices asking questions. He heard and Myra giving careful answers. The wardens searched for over an hour but found nothing concrete. When they finally left, Danny allowed himself to breathe again. But the danger was not over. Explained that the wardens remained suspicious. They would be watching the house. Any unusual activity would be reported immediately. Danny could not stay here any longer. Every moment he remained put the sisters at greater risk. It was time to take a chance. It was time to visit the Forbidden Archives. The journey across the city was the most terrifying experience of Danny's life. He had faced combat situations during his training. He had survived the crash that brought him to this world, but nothing had prepared him for the simple act of traveling through a city built for giants. Myra had volunteered to carry him. She had modified her traveling cloak to include a hidden pocket near her shoulder. Danny would ride there, concealed from view but able to see through a small gap in the fabric. would stay behind to maintain the appearance of normalcy in case the wardens were watching. They left before dawn when the streets were mostly empty. Danny climbed into the pocket and pressed himself against the fabric as Myra stepped out of the house. Each of her footsteps was like an earthquake. Danny could feel the motion in his entire body as she walked. The vibrations traveled through her flesh and into the pocket where he hid. He had to hold on tightly to avoid being thrown around like a pebble in a drum. Through the gap in the fabric, he watched the city pass by. The buildings rose around him like cliffs of stone and metal. Vehicles moved through the streets that were each large enough to carry a human house. Pedestrians walked past, each one of them a titan who could crush him without even noticing. The noise was overwhelming. Voices boomed like thunder. Machinery rumbled like distant earthquakes. Even the sound of footsteps on pavement was loud enough to hurt his ears. Danny pressed his hands against the sides of his head and tried to focus on breathing. Myra walked for over an hour. She moved through residential districts and commercial zones and government sectors. Danny memorized the route as best he could in case he needed to find his way back alone. Finally, they reached the outer wall of the Forbidden Archives. The building was ancient and massive even by standards. Its walls were made of dark stone that seemed to absorb light. Symbols were carved above the entrance that Danny could not read but understood perfectly well. This place was meant to inspire fear. It was meant to keep people away. Myra stopped in a quiet corner where no one would notice them. She opened her cloak slightly and looked down at Danny. "I cannot go any further," she whispered. "There are guards at every entrance. They would question why I was here." Danny nodded. He had expected this. The next part of the journey was his alone. "There is a drainage channel on the east side," Myra continued. "It is too small for it to enter, but you should be able to pass through. It leads into the lower levels of the archives." She lowered her hand, and Danny climbed onto her palm. For a moment they looked at each other. Then Myra gently set him down on a ledge near the drainage channel. "Be careful," she said, "and come back alive." Danny watched her walk away until she disappeared into the crowd. Then he turned to face the dark opening of the drainage channel. It was time to move. The channel was about 10 feet wide by Danny's scale, large enough to walk through comfortably, but not so large that he would be seen by any guards looking down from above. The floor was damp and slippery. The walls were covered with some kind of slime that glowed faintly in the darkness. Danny was grateful for the light. He had not brought any illumination of his own. He walked for what felt like miles. The channel twisted and turned and branched into smaller passages. Danny chose his path based on instinct, always moving toward what felt like the center of the building. Occasionally he heard sounds echoing from above. Footsteps, voices, the grinding of heavy doors opening and closing. Eventually, the channel opened into a vast chamber. Danny emerged onto a ledge high above the floor and looked down at a sight that took his breath away. The Forbidden Archives stretched out before him like a museum of the impossible. Shelves rose from floor to ceiling, hundreds of feet tall, filled with objects of every shape and size. Strange machines sat in glass cases. Crystalline structures pulsed with inner light. Weapons and tools and devices that Danny could not identify were arranged in careful rows. And there, in a section near the back of the chamber, were spacecraft. Danny counted at least a dozen vessels. Some were barely larger than his hand. Others were the size of houses. A few were clearly alien in design with shapes and materials that no human would have created. But several looked familiar. They had the clean lines and practical construction that marked human engineering. Other humans had crashed here before him. Other ships had fallen from the sky and been locked away by the... Danny felt a strange mix of hope and sadness. He was not the first, but he might be the last if he did not escape. He began climbing down from the ledge. The walls of the chamber were rough stone with plenty of handholds. For a human-sized being, the descent was difficult but not impossible. For thee it would have been like climbing a flat surface. Danny reached the floor and began moving between the shelves. The artifacts around him were fascinating, but he did not have time to examine them. He needed to find a compatible fuel cell and get out before anyone noticed his presence. He reached the section with the spacecraft and began searching. Most of the human vessels were ancient, crashed decades or centuries ago. Their technology was outdated and damaged beyond repair. But one ship caught his attention. It was small, barely larger than his own Meadowlark. The design was modern. It could not have crashed more than a few years ago. Danny climbed onto its hull and looked through a cracked viewport. The interior was a mess, but the components were intact, including a compact fusion cell that looked identical to the one he needed. Danny found an access panel and it opened. The fuel cell was locked in place with standard human fasteners. He had the tools in his kit. He could remove it in minutes. He was halfway through the extraction when the alarms began to sound. The noise was deafening. Red lights flashed throughout the chamber. Danny heard shouting from somewhere above and the thunderous sound of running footsteps. They knew he was here. Danny worked faster, his hands shaking as he loosened the final fastener. The fuel cell came free and he strapped it to his back. It was heavy but manageable. He jumped down from the ship and began running toward the drainage channel. But the guards were already in the chamber. Danny could see their massive forms moving between the shelves. They carried lights that swept across the floor like searchlights. They were looking for him. Danny ducked behind an artifact and pressed himself against the cold metal. The lights passed over his hiding spot but did not find him. He waited until the guards moved on and then continued toward the exit. The next 10 minutes were the longest of his life. Danny moved from shadow to shadow, hiding behind artifacts, crawling under shelves, climbing over obstacles. The guards were everywhere, but they were looking for something their own size. They did not think to check the spaces that a tiny being could squeeze through. He reached the drainage channel and dove inside just as a light swept across the wall behind him. Danny ran through the darkness, following the twisting passages back toward the exit. His lungs burned and his legs ached, but he did not stop. He could hear voices echoing behind him. The guards had discovered the channel. They were sending something after him. He emerged into the open air and found Myra waiting exactly where she had left him. She had seen the alarms, she had heard the commotion, and she had stayed anyway. Danny climbed onto her outstretched hand, and she tucked him into the hidden pocket. Then she began walking calmly toward the center of the plaza. Behind them, the forbidden archives erupted with activity. Guards poured out of every entrance. Officers shouted orders. A search began that would spread across the entire district. But by the time they thought to question the ordinary citizen walking home through the plaza, Myra was already gone. Danny had what he needed. The fuel cell was pressed against his back, heavy and precious. Now he just had to get home and install it in his ship. Escape was finally within reach. The next 3 days were filled with tension and fear. The entire city was searching for whoever had broken into the forbidden archives. Wardens patrolled every street. Citizens were questioned about suspicious activity. The ruling council issued statements demanding that the criminal be found and brought to justice. And Myra pretended everything was normal. They went about their daily routines and answered questions politely and showed no signs of guilt. But inside their home, they worked frantically to help Danny complete his repairs. The fuel cell from the archives was exactly what Danny needed. He installed it in his ship's engine compartment and connected it to the power distribution systems. For the first time since the crash, the Meadowlark hummed with energy. The lights came on. The computers booted up. The navigation system displayed a map of the surrounding space. Danny ran diagnostic after diagnostic. The hull was damaged but sealed well enough to survive atmospheric exit. The navigation computer was functioning at reduced capacity but could still plot a course home. Life support was stable. The engines were ready to fire. He could escape. He could actually escape. But there was a problem. The ship needed a clear path to launch. The garden where it had crashed was surrounded by walls and overlooked by neighboring structures. Any attempt to take off would be witnessed by hundreds of. The authorities would be alerted immediately. And more importantly, the trajectory would reveal exactly where he had been hiding. And Myra would be arrested within minutes. Danny explained the problem to the sisters and they discussed possible solutions. They could move the ship at night, but it was too heavy for them to carry without making noise. They could create a distraction elsewhere in the city, but the wardens were on high alert and would not be fooled easily. They could wait until the search died down, but every day increased the risk of discovery. None of the options were good. On the morning of the 4th day, Senior Warden came to the house. Danny was working in the garden when he heard the knock on the front door. He dropped his tools and ran for cover, hiding behind a pile of debris just as the door opened. Through a gap in the debris, he watched the scene unfold. Was tall even by standards. She wore a dark uniform that marked her rank and carried herself with the confidence of someone who was used to being obeyed. Her eyes were cold and calculating. She looked around the room like she was already searching for evidence. Invited her inside and offered refreshments, declined and got straight to the point. "I am investigating the breach at the Forbidden Archives," she said. "Witnesses reported seeing a citizen matching your sister's description in the area shortly after the alarms were triggered." His face showed nothing but confusion. "My sister Myra, she was home with me that evening. We were preparing dinner together." Studied her for a long moment. Then she produced a small device and activated it. A projection appeared showing the plaza outside the archives. Figures moved through the space, going about their business. Then the image zoomed in on a familiar form. Myra, walking calmly away from the archives just minutes after the breach was discovered. "This woman was seen leaving the area," said. "Do you deny that it is your sister?" Looked at the image and shook her head. "It could be anyone. Many citizens look similar from a distance." "Indeed," replied. "But this citizen paused near the drainage channel exit exactly long enough for something small to climb onto her hand. My analysts have examined the recording carefully. Something was there even if we cannot see it clearly." Danny felt his heart sink. They had been careful but not careful enough. Myra entered the room at that moment, having heard the conversation from another part of the house. She looked at with an expression of polite confusion. "Senior Warden, how can I help you?" Turned her cold gaze on Myra. "You can explain why you were near the Forbidden Archives on the evening of the breach. You can explain why you stopped near a drainage channel. And you can explain what you picked up and concealed in your clothing." Myra did not flinch. "I was walking home from visiting a friend. I stopped because I felt faint from the heat. I picked up nothing because there was nothing to pick up." It was a weak story and everyone in the room knew it, smiled slightly. "I see. Then you will not mind if my officers conduct a thorough search of your property." She did not wait for permission. She made a signal and moments later a dozen wardens entered the house. They began opening cabinets and moving furniture and looking into every corner. Danny watched helplessly as they moved through the garden. One of them approached the pile of debris where his ship was hidden. Another headed toward the storage area where he had been sleeping. This was it. He was going to be discovered. The sisters were going to be arrested. Everything they had risked would be for nothing. Then Myra did something unexpected. She swayed on her feet and collapsed to the ground. The effect was immediate. Several wardens rushed to help her, stepped back in surprise, cried out and knelt beside her sister, calling for water and medicine. In the confusion, Danny made a decision. He ran from his hiding spot to the storage area where his ship was concealed. The wardens were distracted. No one was watching the garden. He climbed into the Meadowlark and began powering up the engines. The ship hummed louder and louder. The sound would attract attention soon, but Danny did not care. He was going to launch. He was going to escape. He would draw the wardens away from the sisters and give them a chance to talk their way out of trouble. But then he heard his voice, clear and loud, cutting through the chaos. She was refusing to abandon Myra. She was telling the wardens that her sister had been ill for weeks. She was inventing a story about a mysterious condition that caused fainting spells. It was obvious that she was buying time. Buying time for him. Danny looked at the launch controls. Then he looked back at the house where two giantesses were risking everything to protect him. Two people who owed him nothing. Two friends who had chosen to help a tiny stranger from another world. He could not abandon them. Danny shut down the engines and climbed out of the ship. He found a hiding spot and waited while the search continued. Myra eventually recovered from her fainting spell. The wardens finished their inspection but found nothing conclusive, looked disappointed but had no grounds to make an arrest. As she was leaving, she paused at the door and looked back at the sisters. "I know you are hiding something," she said. "I will find out what it is, and when I do there will be consequences." The door closed behind her, and silence filled the house. Danny emerged from his hiding spot and climbed up to where the sisters were sitting. They looked exhausted and frightened, but also relieved. "That was too close," Myra said quietly. Danny nodded. "We need a new plan, one that does not put you at risk." Shook her head. "There is no plan that does not put us at risk. We made our choice when we decided to help you. We knew what we were getting into." Danny looked at these two incredible women who had given him shelter and hope. They were giants compared to him, but their hearts were as human as anyone he had ever known. He thought about his options. He thought about what he had learned during his time on this world. He thought about thee and their fear of the unknown. And slowly, an idea began to form. It was crazy, it was dangerous, it might get them all killed. But it might also change everything. Returned the next morning with a full investigation team. She had spent the night gathering evidence and building a case. The recordings from the archives, the testimony from neighbors, the timeline of suspicious activities, all of it pointed to the sisters. Danny watched from his hiding spot as a dozen wardens surrounded the house. This time there would be no distraction. This time they would find everything. And Myra sat together in the main room as laid out her evidence. The senior warden spoke calmly and confidently. She explained each piece of the puzzle and how it connected to the sisters. She described the unknown object that had been stolen from the archives. She presented her theory that the sisters were harboring something alien and dangerous. You have one chance to cooperate, said. Surrender whatever you are hiding and the council may show mercy. Looked at her sister. Myra looked back. Neither of them spoke. Sighed and signaled her officers. Search everything. Leave nothing unexamined. The wardens spread out through the house and garden. One of them headed directly for the storage area where the Meadowlark was hidden. Another began removing the debris that covered the ship. Danny knew he had run out of time. He climbed into the cockpit and sealed the hatch behind him. The systems were already warm from his earlier attempt to launch. All he needed to do was push the throttle forward and he would be free. But he could not do that. He could not leave and Myra to face punishment for helping him. They had risked their lives and their freedom. They had shown him kindness when they had every reason to be afraid. If he escaped now, they would be convicted of harboring an alien. They would be imprisoned or worse. Danny made his decision. Instead of flying up toward space, he aimed the Meadowlark toward the central plaza. The ship burst out of the garden with a roar of engines. Wardens dove out of the way as the tiny vessel screamed overhead, shouted orders, but no one could react fast enough. Danny was already gone, racing between buildings at speeds they had never seen. He flew toward the heart of the city where the ruling council held their sessions. He flew past towers and monuments and crowded streets filled with shocked citizens looking up at the impossible sight. A machine from the stars, flying through their city. Danny activated every communication system on his ship. He broadcast on every frequency. He transmitted images of Earth, recordings of human music and language, mathematical equations that any intelligent species would recognize, and a simple message repeated over and over. We are not alone, we come in peace, we wish to be friends. The message spread across like wildfire. Citizens stopped in the streets to listen. Officials abandoned their duties to watch the tiny spacecraft circling above. The ruling council gathered on their balcony and stared in disbelief. Danny brought the Meadowlark down in the central plaza and landed gently on the ancient stones. The crowd that had gathered kept their distance, watching with a mixture of fear and fascination. He opened the hatch and stepped out. 1,000 purple eyes looked down at him. A tiny creature, smaller than their children, standing alone in the heart of their civilization. Danny spoke through his translation device, projecting his voice so that everyone could hear. My name is Danny Cole. I am a human from a planet called Earth. I crashed on your world by accident and was helped by 2 of your citizens. They showed me kindness when they could have turned me over to the authorities. They risked everything to protect a stranger from the stars. He pointed toward the edge of the plaza, where and Myra were being held by wardens. Those women are not criminals. They are heroes. They represent the best of what your people can be. They saw something they did not understand, and instead of fearing it, they chose to help. The crowd murmured. The council members whispered among themselves. Pushed through the crowd and approached the tiny figure standing on the plaza stones. You are the intruder, she said. You broke into the forbidden archives. You stole from our sacred vaults. I took only what I needed to repair my ship, Danny replied. A fuel cell that has been sitting unused for decades. I did not come to steal or to harm. I came only because I crashed and wanted to go home. He looked up at the council balcony. I could have escaped this morning. My ship was ready, but I chose to stay because I could not abandon the friends who helped me. I chose to reveal myself because hiding was putting innocent people in danger. He paused and let his words sink in. I come from a species that values loyalty and courage and compassion. We are small compared to you, but we have hearts just as big. We have explored the stars and met other civilizations and made alliances across the galaxy. We would like to make an alliance with you as well." The plaza was silent. Every present was staring at this impossible creature who had fallen from the sky and now stood before them speaking of friendship and cooperation. One of the council members, an elderly female with silver hair, raised her voice. "Why should we believe anything you say? You are an unknown, a potential threat. How do we know your people will not come here with weapons and armies?" Danny met her gaze without flinching. "You do not know, just as I did not know if Myra would help me or turn me over to be studied like an animal. Trust is always a risk, but without trust there can be no friendship. Without friendship there can be no alliance. And without alliance we are all alone in a universe that is far too large for any species to face by itself." The council deliberated for 3 days. Danny remained in the plaza, refusing to leave until a decision was made. Citizens came to see him, curious about the tiny being from another world. Some were afraid, others were fascinated. A few brought him small gifts of food and water. And Myra were released on the 2nd day. They came to sit with Danny and keep him company as he waited. "You did not have to do this," said quietly. "You could have escaped." Danny shook his head. "And left you to face the consequences alone. That is not who I am. That is not who humans are." On the 3rd day, the council announced their decision. Danny Cole would be allowed to leave Prime and return to his people, but he would carry a message with him, an invitation from the to establish diplomatic contact. They wished to learn more about humanity and the galaxy beyond their world. Before he departed, Danny said goodbye to the sisters who had saved his life, gave him a small crystal, a traditional gift symbolizing friendship across distance. Myra simply told him to fly safely and to remember them. Danny climbed into the Meadowlark and powered up the engines. The crowd that had gathered to watch cheered as the tiny ship rose into the air. He circled the plaza once, twice, 3 times, and then aimed his nose toward the sky. The atmosphere fell away behind him. The stars appeared, bright and welcoming. Danny set a course for Earth and engaged the faster-than-light drive. His crash had been a disaster. His time among the Giantesses had been terrifying and wonderful. His escape had required risking everything he had. But what he was bringing home was worth more than his own survival. He was bringing proof that humans could find friends in the most unexpected places. He was bringing an invitation that could change history. And he was bringing memories of 2 giantesses who had looked at a tiny stranger and seen not a threat but a friend. Humanity had always been small compared to the universe, but Danny Cole had proven what humans had known all along. Size does not matter. What matters is the size of your heart.